Thus, Britain has banned the Palestinian militant group Hamas. The move brings the United Kingdom's stance on Gaza's rulers in line with the United States and the European Union. British Interior Minister Priti Patel said Hamas will be banned under the Terrorism Act, and anyone expressing support for the organization, flying its flag or even arranging meetings for Hamas would be in breach of the law. Patel is expected to present the change to Parliament next week. Hamas has political and military wings. It opposes the existence of Israel and peace talks, instead advocating armed resistance against Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories. Until now, Britain had banned only its military arm, the Izz al-Din al-Qassam brigades. Hamas is on the United States list of designated foreign terrorist organizations. The European Union also deems it a terrorist movement.
Today, I have laid an order in the United Kingdom Parliament to amend Schedule 2 of the Terrorism Act 2000 to prescribe Hamas in its entirety, including its political wing. Hamas has significant terrorist capability, including access to extensive and sophisticated weaponry, as well as terrorist training facilities, and it has long been involved in significant terrorist violence. But the current listing of Hamas creates an artificial distinction between various parts of that organisation. It is right that that listing is updated to reflect this. This is an important step, especially for the Jewish community. Hamas is fundamentally and rabidly anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism is an enduring evil which I will never tolerate. Jewish people routinely feel unsafe at school, in the streets, when they worship, in their homes and online. This step will strengthen the case against anyone who waves a Hamas flag in the United Kingdom, an act that is bound to make Jewish people and the community feel unsafe. Anyone who supports or invites support for a prescribed organisation is breaking the law. That now includes Hamas in whatever form it takes.
Naeem Jinnah is the Executive Director of the Afro-Middle East Center, a research institute dedicated to studying the Middle East and North Africa and relations between that region and the rest of Africa. He joins us now via Zoom. Mr. Naeem Jinnah, very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us and a warm welcome to the Globe. We've just seen a British Interior Minister there unrelenting and taking a hardline stance against Hamas. But how significant of a blow will this be towards funding and fundraising for Hamas?
Well, it will have an effect, certainly, on the organization. I mean, Hamas has supporters in the United Kingdom, and they will be affected by this. But this kind of designation, even banning, for example, symbols of the organization, really is very much of an extremist kind of measure. I mean, one thinks back to the 60s, 70s and 80s in South Africa, when symbols of liberation movements were banned, etc. It's the same kind of thing. And so, people could get up to 14 years imprisonment if they, in a march, for example, unfurled a Hamas flag. So it will have an effect, certainly, on the organization. How serious of an effect, we wait to see, but it definitely will.
But just how likely will this stop? I mean, will this prescription stop Hamas in its tracks?
No, it's not going to stop Hamas in its tracks. I mean, Hamas is a liberation movement. It's a political party. It operates within the Palestinian context. It has members in various refugee camps around Palestine. It has support or relations with a number of governments, including the South African government, the Russian government, the Chinese government, some European governments, etc. It's not proscribed by the United Nations. So it's not going to be stopped in its tracks. It's not going to end its program, whether political or military. It's not suddenly going to give up the armed struggle. And none of that is going to happen. It will make its life slightly more difficult, particularly in the UK, but not much else.
Mr. Chima, remember that former opposition Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn notoriously referred to Hamas as his friends, and he invited Hamas-affiliated people to speak in Parliament, including extremists who praised suicide bombers and called for attacks on British troops. So will this have an impact on, between the relationship of the Labour Party and Hamas?
I think, firstly, the notion that any Hamas person is an extremist who calls for suicide attacks and blowing up civilians, etc., is very problematic. Certainly, Jeremy Corbyn made that statement. But yes, so, when Hamas leadership was in South Africa and was met with the president of South Africa, the president of the ruling party, the general secretary of the ruling party, had media conferences together with them, and the ruling party in South Africa invited them to open an office, etc. It's a legitimate political party. In that particular context. It won elections in that particular context. It's a reality that exists. Priti Patel has proven herself to be an extremist right-winger, Islamophobic, xenophobic, anti-immigrant, and now anti-Palestinian. This is just a kind of extremist move, taking this really very far.
So, in short, Jeremy Corbyn himself faces up to 10 years in jail if he continues and maintains contact with his Hamas friends, as he calls them.
Yes, he would. In terms of the law that she wants to pass, yes, that would be the case. She wants to pass this in terms of ban Hamas in terms of the terrorism law. And so Jeremy Corbyn, if he were to make those kind of statements or those kind of invitations, etc., would open himself up to be tried then under the terrorism law. The other aspect of this, of course, is the problem with these terrorism laws across the world, including in South Africa, that the notion of terrorism is such a difficult one, one that has hundreds of different definitions, and to have a law that kind of blankets people as terrorists is seriously problematic. Even, as I said, including in the South African context.
Well, Hamas attributes the banning in the United Kingdom to the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which affirmed British support for establishing a Jewish state. Do they have a point, though? Is this the bone of contention, or is it simply all the things that Hamas has been accused of doing?
Well, the banning is not because of the Balfour Declaration, but the point that they and other Palestinian groups have been making over the past couple of days is that Britain has, to a great extent, been responsible for the problem that has been caused in Palestine. It was Britain that promised the Zionist movement a homeland in Palestine without consulting the Palestinians. It was Britain that had Palestine as a mandate and then handed it over to the Zionist movement for the creation of the Israeli state. So Britain in Palestine, as in various other parts of the world that it had colonized, South Africa, India, various other parts of Africa, etc., has left an enduring legacy of problems, difficulty, and oppression, frankly. Similar to what we're seeing in South Africa, the legacy that we have here, including the apartheid legacy, is an inheritance from British colonial rule. And so in the Palestinian context, they certainly have a great deal of share of the blame for the problems that exist there, and for the occupation and colonization, the occupation and colonization of Palestinian territories, and the apartheid that Israel propagates and practices in Palestine. To a great extent, the blame for that lies at the doors of the Brits. So what they're doing now is taking that even further than they had in the past. Instead of making amends for it and trying to find a solution, they're making the situation worse.
Well, Hamas does not see themselves as a terrorist organization, do they? But interestingly, they did not dispute, Premier Patel's claim that they are indeed a terrorist organization, and they subscribe to a terrorist academy with sophisticated weaponry. So, what does that mean, or what does it tell you in terms of their position, or in terms of whether they are a terrorist organization or not?
No, Hamas, as well as various other Palestinian political groups, have come out against this designation and opposed the notion that any Palestinian liberation movement is terrorist. They've done that over the past couple of days after Priti Patel's statements. They do not regard themselves as a terrorist organization. They rule a territory. The fact that they have weapons, of course they have weapons. They rule a territory. They defend that territory, and they have an armed struggle against the occupation of their territory. Under international law, any occupied people has a right to self-defense, including through armed means. So they are exercising that right to defend their territory, to defend their people, to oppose the occupation, to oppose the colonization of their people's territory. It's a right that they have under international law, and this is why the United Nations has not designated Hamas a terrorist organization, because it acts as a liberation movement and a political party.
So, in short, violent resistance against Israel is legitimate under international law.
Absolutely. Armed resistance against an occupying power is legitimate under international law. And that is what Hamas and various other groups, not just Hamas, of course, the PFLP, the DFLP, Fatah, have armed wings that engage in an armed struggle against the Israeli occupation, and those forms of armed struggle are legitimate under international law.
So then, do they have a point then in saying that resisting occupation by any available means, including armed resistance, is a right guaranteed to people under occupation in international law? I mean, it's the occupation that is terrorism. Now, the United Kingdom has branded Hamas as a terrorist organization, yet Hamas feels that the international law pretty much backs them.
Well, the international law does support the notion, as I said, of various forms of resistance against occupation, including armed resistance, as well as various forms of resistance against colonialism. And there's a huge body of opinion that argues that what Israel is doing in Palestine is colonialism. So they have the right to oppose that, including through armed means. And yes, I mean, that right is one that is guaranteed. They can continue in that, and Israel has to deal with that. What the United Kingdom is doing is attempting to brand, in fact, any form of opposition, particularly armed opposition, but any form of opposition, because what they've done now is banned the political wing of Hamas, any form of opposition to occupation and colonialism as terrorism. Now, today it might be in the Palestinian context, but today it might be Hamas. Tomorrow it might be other Palestinian groups. And what prevents them from doing the same with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or various factions of Fatah, for example. And the day after, it could be groups in various other parts of the world that are fighting for their rights and fighting for their freedoms. This kind of designation on the basis simply of who they support politically is a very problematic one, because it therefore is a political designation, not a legal one. And Priti Patel saying fallaciously that this designation is because of anti-Semitism is ridiculous. Hamas, no Palestinian group has any intention of undertaking any operations, any attacks, etc., in the United Kingdom. So why would Jewish people in the United Kingdom see a Hamas flag, or perhaps tomorrow they'll extend it to any Palestinian flag, would see a Hamas flag and feel afraid, as she's saying? Where's the anti-Semitism in this? Hamas, as well as various other Palestinian groups, are fighting for their freedom and their liberation against an occupation that has existed for the past 70 years. And their theater of operations is where that occupation exists, not in Europe, not in the United Kingdom.
So how significantly will this move embolden Israel in its position and stance against Hamas and in its continued occupation of Palestinian territories?
Well, Israel has been trying for a long time to get all Palestinian groups designated as terrorists around the world, including by the United Nations. It hasn't really succeeded, all except, of course, those that it favors. The one or two that it favors, that it thinks that it can collaborate with or can collaborate with it. In reality, on the ground, in the Palestinian context, this is not going to make much of a difference to the balance of power between Israel and the Palestinian groups. But certainly, it's a symbolic victory for Israel at a diplomatic and a political level.
Let's talk about Priti Patel. Remember that in 2017 she was forced to resign as Britain's International Development Secretary after she failed to disclose meetings with senior Israeli officials during a private holiday trip to the country. Now that she's made such a hardline stance and was quite unrelenting against Hamas, is this an indication perhaps that Britain is great allies with Israel and in its continued, it is indirectly attacking supporting, as it were, the violence that is perpetrated on Palestinian people?
Well, not indirectly. It's directly supporting that violence and occupation, colonialism against Palestinian people. But Britain has been an ally of Israel from the day that the Israeli state was created in 1948. Priti Patel seems to be much more of an ally than the British government and British establishment. And clearly, as you point out, she's received favors from Israel and the Zionist movement, and she's now repaying those favors to them.